embarrassing for them. But you can begin to see that things are beginning to quickly change. By the way, anytime you have innovation and change, it's a little bit challenging. The question is, can church members handle those changes? As a historian, that's what historians do, is studying change over time. We're looking at those kinds of things, and anytime there's something new, it's a little bit dangerous. William Ward Simpson, for example, we have these actual papier-mâché beasts. He got the radical idea of having evangelistic meetings where up in the ceiling were these papier-mâché beasts, and then as he's preaching, they would drop down the ceiling right above people's heads. And this was right before Ellen White died. So when she's still alive, then people did what people did when Ellen White was alive. If you didn't like something, you would write a letter complaining to Ellen White. And when she heard about what William Ward Simpson was doing, she told him, leave him alone. He's trying to be creative and don't be too quick to judge, these kinds of things. So she was trying to be actually a supportive church leader as well as a founding prophetic voice of our church to some of these kinds of innovations. By the way, this is true throughout all of Adventist history. Like the last 2 weeks, I did a deep dive on the history of the organ. You want a fun study, is go in and look at all the organ controversies in the 1870s when they first installed an organ in the dime tabernacle, and they'll make all the 20th century worship wars that people have had. It will make it look very tame. So, these are the kinds of things that, can you imagine people fighting over the organ? If they start playing the organ, it's going to make you start feeling and doing certain kinds of things that, and you start thinking, wow, some things haven't changed, with human nature, but there you go. And there begins to be, not only within Adventism, but within the wider Christian world, an interest in Bible prophecy and the question of the end of times. And so you have a series of these prophetic conferences. You had some going back to the 19th century. It wasn't that unusual, but especially in and around World War I, where some of these conservative Christians who began to call themselves the fundamentalists, we'll come back to this term again here, trying to understand it, but they're self-describing themselves as in these kinds of ways. And they're actually having these huge conferences, thousands of people showing up and preaching this proclamation, Jesus is coming again. People are excited. In fact, there's so much good publicity, and church leaders, Adventist church leaders, are attending these meetings saying, wait a minute, what happens if there's other Christians, other churches that are doing a better job than we as Adventists are at proclaiming the news about Jesus and his soon return, about end time events, all of this kind of stuff. And so you read a whole bunch of these reports by church leaders, and I'm going to give you the Michael Campbell, what I call the Campbell soup, right? So I call it the soup notes. The soup note summary here of this is that our church leaders were just a tad bit green with envy as they were attending these meetings. Wait a minute, how is it that they can have these prophecy conferences and do so well at this sort of thing? So you're seeing a number of these prophecy conferences taking place. You also have the end of an era as a number of church leaders are passing away. Those founding leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, of early Adventism, people like S.N. Haskell, very important here in New England, J.N. Loughborough as well. And it's sort of they're kind of their final memories and memoirs and chronicles, and especially the idea of living without a living prophet. What would it be like without Ellen White alive? You see, when she's alive, if there were questions, what did she actually teach? What did she mean by something? You could write to her, or you could write to one of her staff, or maybe her son, Willie White, and they could respond and try to write a letter explaining. And it's like kind of like people were tattletaling on Ellen White about Ellen White. There's a whole bunch of these great stories. One of them, my favorite one, is in Elmshaven, where Ellen White's grandchildren were enrolled in the local school. And kind of like the whole story about how young can you baptize someone, Ellen White makes a statement about some children being too young to be enrolled in school. So Ellen White's grandchildren, they want to enroll them, and they're like, wait a minute, it's a little bit of an awkward conversation, but your grandmother says that we shouldn't enroll you because you're too young. So they refused to enroll Ellen White's grandchildren. And Ellen White heard about it and said, why don't you come on up here? I think they were a little bit afraid, so they brought the whole school board up to Elmshaven to have a little conversation with Ellen White. And to me, this has to be one of the most interesting things in the Adventist archives that I've ever seen with Ellen White. Is this transcript of the school board with Ellen White, and they're like, well, Ellen White, we want to remind you about what you wrote about children being too young when you enroll them in school. And Ellen White, no uncertain terms, says, well, that was the best we could do before we had regular schools, and we didn't have, and that this council wasn't meant to be, and again, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but wasn't meant to fit all situations at all times and places, but some children can learn and much younger than others should be enrolled, and so basically she's telling him, you're misinterpreting my writing, so stop it and enroll my grandkids in your school. And that's, in the end, what happened. And so when she's alive, she can explain these things. But now that she's no longer alive, they realize the end is coming. And there is probably one of the more unusual pictures in the Adventist archives. There's Ellen White at her funeral. I guess that was kind of a thing in the 19th century. I don't know, in your family. It's not something we do anymore very often, but about 50 to 100 years ago, people liked to take pictures of people there in their funerals and their casket. That's Ellen White in her casket, and in fact, it's quite an interesting long story right there. But the story actually gets really kind of a little bit crazy, because Ellen White, she's hardly dead, and they hardly bury her. Then there's somebody claiming to be her prophetic successor. Margaret Rowan. Are you familiar with the story of Margaret Rowan? One of the more unusual stories in Adventist history. She was a young convert going to a Bible study group, a group of women. She's taken off in vision, and I've read a number of her different visions. The first few visions are very, Jesus is coming, you should need to do more to keep the Sabbath carefully, and health reform is really important, these kinds of things. God loves you. Be ready for Jesus when he comes. But as time goes along, the church did what the church always does so very well. What the church does when you have a new prophet. Any of you meet a prophet, or is it just me that keeps bumping into prophets? I don't know. I could tell you a lot of stories, but in fact, I met one. Well, I won't tell you about that one. But anyways, Margaret Rowan is claiming to be a prophet, and so the church established a committee. Some of you are longtime church workers, that's what the church does very well. So established a committee to investigate. It's very slow to evaluate all of these things, and they're just kind of watching, and as time goes along, the church will actually begin to claim more and more grandiose things. She'll claim that in the vault of the Ellen White estate is a signed letter by Ellen White, designating her to be her prophetic successor. They said, oh, that's crazy. So they look in the vault of the Ellen White estate, and guess what? There was. Here's the letter. You can see it was an obvious forgery. I can give you about 30 reasons why this is a forgery. The wrong paper, wrong place, wrong size paper, wrong. The watermark in the paper is wrong. The holes would always be punched on a different side. And anyways, there's a long list of things. It's clearly a demonstrable forgery. But the question was, how did that letter get in there? Well, the story gets a little bit better, because Margaret Rowan's most loyal supporter was a young couple, Bert Fulmer, a physician, and his wife. And at one point, he discovered, they invested their entire life savings into her ministry, and then they discovered that she was stealing from her own ministry. Now disenchanted, disillusioned, he sends a telegram to the general conference, says, I'm ready to confess that I was the one who broke into the vault of the White Estate and planted the letter. You see, Margaret Rowan had come to him, said that she didn't believe her own prophetic calling. So God had brought the letter from the White Estate, given it to her, and now God had tasked her to tell him to go put it back. And he believed her. But now disillusioned, he was going to confess. But that night, before he had a chance to confess, that next day when he was going to meet with church leaders, he was a physician, so he got a house call to some motel or something. And as he showed up into the hotel, knocked on the door, as he was about to go in, Margaret Rowan was there with two of her other followers, and they pounced on him. They had clubs and everything else, and they made such a commotion that the people in the adjoining motel room called the police. By the time the police arrived, they found Margaret Rowan and her two other followers dragging his body in a burlap bag as they were carrying shovels across the parking lot. Amazingly enough, he did not die. He did not die. I mean, sometimes you can't make this stuff up. Yeah, and but started a 3-day manhunt chase across Southern California trying to find Margaret Rowan, and he eventually did have explained and put on record what happened, but unfortunately he was poisoned. He didn't know it yet, and he eventually did die after all. So it became a murder trial. She skipped on bail and was never seen or heard from again. And so thus continues the murder mystery of Dr. Fulmer and whatever did indeed happen to Margaret Rowan. So if you happen to know the rest of the story, let me know. And it's one of those things where you're always still looking for more of that information. So I have a question for you this evening. If I were to ask you, we're talking about fundamentalism, but right now I want to ask you first another question. Are Adventists evangelical? Now, let me preface that and say that I'm not talking about in terms of modern politics and what's going on in our country today. I'm talking about in the classic historical sense of the word evangelical. And you're probably asking, saying, Michael, what do you mean? What's an evangelical? Well, one of my wife's favorite professors at Baylor, where she just completed her doctoral studies, David Bebbington, and really loved and appreciated Dr. Bebbington. In fact, we went to his retirement program before his last doctoral seminar that he taught and so on. And so I saw him, and I knew he was a great bibliophile. So I said, Dr. Bebbington, I have to ask you, how many books do you have? And he said, well, he looked at me, he said, Michael, I'm not really sure. But last time I counted, it was over 70,000. See, he had filled up his house with books, built a study out in the garden, filled that up with books, and then bought the house next to him and filled that up with books too. So Sean, my wife and I have a new policy that every book that comes in, a book has to go out. And so we don't want to have like a Bebbington crisis in our we can't afford 3 houses for all of our books. But Dr. Bebbington, I asked him, I said, I know you're really famous for this. There's even a Wikipedia page for this, the Bebbington Quadrilateral. It's the definition, the classic definition of evangelicalism, of the historical term evangelical, talking about the Reformation, the evangelical religion, referring to the gospel message, right? So, and so there's 4 definitions, and he said, well, if I knew I was going to be famous for this, I wouldn't have just put it in the preface to one of my first books when I was a young scholar. I thought I was just stating the obvious, that what everyone already knew. And it's these 4 things, and here we go. Number 1 is evangelism. Do Adventists believe in evangelism? I hope so, right? Number 2, crucicentrism. We're talking about a theology of the cross, that we believe in the atonement of Jesus Christ. Is that something we adhere to as Adventists? You're all nodding your heads. Yes, I sure hope so. Number 3 is conversionism. Do we believe in having a personal conversion, a personal relationship with Jesus? Absolutely. And then finally, biblicism. Do we believe in the authority of the Bible, of Scripture? And I hope you would agree with me again, yes, as Adventists. So in the classic sense of an evangelical, in this historical sense, the Bebbington Quadrilateral, if you please, I hope you would agree that Adventists, yes, indeed, are evangelical, right? Now the question is, are Adventists fundamentalists? What do you think? Now you're not so sure. Now you're not so sure. Some of you are shaking your heads. Some are saying yes, some are saying no. Okay, yeah, depending on I guess which way you shake your head, right? Yeah, there you go. Are Adventist fundamentalists? And 100 years ago, the answer would have been a unanimous yes. I have yet to, as a historian, looking at the 19 teens and 20s, find one person who would disagree with the idea that Adventists are anything except. In fact, my favorite phrase is the General Conference President, A.G. Daniels, says that Adventists are the fundamentalists of the fundamentalists. Another church leader said that we are the true fundamentalists. And the question is, where does that phrase, that term fundamentalist come from? And so I'm so glad you asked, because there's these little group of booklets, and I actually am fortunate to have a set of these that someone gave me some time ago, and that's actually a picture I took of them. These small little booklets titled The Fundamentals, and the subtitle, if you look inside the cover, is A Testimony for the Truth. And the story behind the booklets, the story behind the story, is that there were two brothers, Lyman and Milton Stewart. And on their property in Pennsylvania, there was this black ooey gooey stuff that was bubbling up about the time that automobiles were becoming a thing, and they became fabulously wealthy. They found a company called Standard Oil, which today you might be more familiar with the term ExxonMobil, is the successor company to that. They had so much money, they didn't know what to do with it. They're kind of like the original billionaires, right up there with a number of other very, very wealthy industrialists and philanthropists of the turn of the century, and they like to invest their money in missionary causes, sponsoring whole Bible departments, all kinds of different things. But they're especially worried that there were people that they considered to be a threat, that were undermining Christianity, people teaching evolution, people that were questioning the veracity of miracles in the Bible, people questioning whether the atonement of Jesus Christ was anything more than just a metaphor. These were people they thought were downright dangerous. And so they wanted to publish a series of booklets going back to the fundamentals of the faith. And actually, at first, people even derided them, saying, we're going to call you the fundamentalists. So that's a great name. So glad you came up with it. And they just embraced it right away from the beginning. In fact, the first time that we really see in church history, in modern church history, that they're not only defining what is the true faith versus those who are more spurious or dangerous that need to be that were threatening the faith, is to actually come up with a list of different dangerous religious groups that were sects, that were cults even. That would become a commonplace term in the wake of the publication of these booklets, but they were considered to be dangerous. And so Mormons were listed, Jehovah's Witnesses, and I discovered in the archives of the person who put these booklets together at Biola University, there's all this interesting correspondence. They said, we need to include Seventh-day Adventists on the list of cults, of sects that are dangerous. And so they wrote to Lyman and Milton Stewart, and he wrote a letter back, which I found very interesting. He said, those Adventists know their Bibles better than you think they do. Leave them alone. So that's all I know is he told them, hands off, the Adventists, leave them alone. But the guy that was the main editor, did the most editing on this project, A.R. Torrey, he and A.T. Jones met on a train one day, and they did not like each other. They hated each other and spent the rest of their lives attacking each other. So Torrey, with these booklets, wanted nothing more than to list Adventists as a cult, but we missed the first go-around of all of that cult literature and everything else. So you have this movement protecting the faith, defending the faith, a sort of militant. Remember World War I? That the faith had to be, in a sense, that fundamentalism, it's more than a theology, it's a mindset. It's a way of looking at the world around you. Are you going to accept change, or are you going to resist change? Are all these different things that are confronting Christianity, are they something that are dangerous and we need to somehow militantly defend the faith? And George Marsden, who's kind of the leading historian in the world of fundamentalism, has written the book, the defining book of on fundamentalism. One time I was in a seminar where, and someone asked him, he said, help us understand fundamentalism. And he said, the best way to describe fundamentalism or a fundamentalist is that it's a Christian or an evangelical who's mad about something. How do you like that? So this sort of embattled warfare to protect the faith. And so Adventists were deeply, deeply impacted by the rising fundamentalist movement. Let me give you some examples. These are Adventist publications now. One is by Carl B. Haynes, Christianity at the Crossroads. There's only two options. There's modernism or there is fundamentalism. There's no middle ground. It's one or the other. And that's part of the whole fundamentalist phenomena, is this sort of binary that there's only two solutions. There's two ways of looking at things. And then you have William Worth, who is a young professor at what we today call Loma Linda, religion teacher. And this is his booklet, The Battle of the Churches. And you can see a priest knocking out the cornerstone of Jesus Christ and trying to replace it with evolution. There's just so many of these great quotations. I'm not going to read this for the sake of time, but you get an idea that all of our church leaders at that time were very much for fundamentalism. And the question is how fundamentalist would Adventism become? This is the crucial question for us tonight. But here's another example, one of these cartoons, this tidal wave of modernism. And here you have a family standing behind the Word of God. The Scriptures is their only safety. Here's another one of these graphics. I like this one. Here is on one side, you have modernist theology. This is the threat, and here's the only solution, the faith once delivered to the saints. And again, there is no middle ground. You're either for us or against us. And this is the challenge. Now, the problem is that when studying this time period is that no Adventist would say that we should become modernists. We don't need the authority of the Bible or miracles or so on. But sometimes when we fight against something, the danger is that we can, if we're not careful, go to the opposite extreme. And this is the danger, is some people in fighting against something began to polarize or push themselves so much so in the opposite direction that it began to, shall we say, tilt Adventist theology in some new and maybe some uncomfortable directions. And this is especially true when it comes to inspired writings, inspiration. How do we understand the Word of God? How do we interpret the Word of God? And this is one of the challenges that we had historically. It's a challenge that we still have in Adventism today. There are some people that feel it is their duty, their responsibility to protect the church, and that the only way is to militantly safeguard the church through a very rigid way of interpreting inspired writings, especially Ellen White's writings. Let me give you a quick example. I've been a pastor long enough that I can probably tell you this story safely, I think. But when I was a young pastor long ago and far away, I had a church member, and I called him Mr. Potluck Police. Now, I'm sure you don't have a church member like that here, so I can tell you this story. Pastor Sean hasn't told me any stories, so I mean, this is no reflection on you, but I'm just telling you this is Pastor Campbell here in my own experience, okay? So my church member, my head deaconess, she was married to a guy who was not a church member, and one day, trying to be a good pastor, I saw him waiting for her outside church. They only had one car, and so he was going to pick her up, and I ran out to the parking lot, and I said, "Hey, we'd love to have you come in and have lunch with us." And he said, "I'm invited?" I said, "Of course you're invited." Well, I was excited, and he said, "I'm going to go home and I'm going to get some fish." I said, "We've got lots of food." And he said, "No, I insist. I'm going to bring my fish." Well, immediately I knew I had a problem. I was glad he's coming now with the fish, but I had Mr. Potluck Police that I was telling you about. And so he was the guy that was going around with counsels and diets and foods, and he would look at each item and ask questions and say, "That's not approved." And in fact, one time my head elder's wife had breast cancer. He went up to her and said, "If you had only been following the spirit of prophecy, you would not have breast cancer." And I wish you could have seen the tears in her eyes. And so And anyways, so I'm worried. So I'm trying to take one for the team and distract Mr. Potluck Police. And so we're talking, and I said, "Happy Sabbath." And he looked at me and said, "It is not a happy Sabbath." I said, "Well, hello there." And so I'm trying to talk with him, make conversation, and having a little trouble here, but I'm trying my hardest here, okay? I'm really trying. And I'm trying to distract him. But there's one problem when you bring fish to potluck. Yeah. And eventually I saw him come in, he put it on the thing, and he got some lunch, and somebody brought fish to potluck. And I remember looking at him, and I think God gave me some holy boldness, because they don't teach this in seminary. And I looked him in the eyes, and I said, "But what do you do with the fact that Jesus ate fish?" All right, that's pretty good, right? And then he looked at me and he said, "But Jesus didn't have all the truth. He didn't have Ellen White." You see, if Jesus had Ellen White, he would have known he's supposed to be vegetarian, right? And so this is sometimes I think we don't realize what we're saying, right? We don't hear exactly, because I'm sure he wouldn't really, but that's what he said. And I wonder sometimes if we run into trouble, don't we? That we can. And so we all interpret inspired writings. This is what we call hermeneutics, how we interpret the Word of God. Anybody that's married, you practice hermeneutics. Trust me, you practice hermeneutics, don't you? Yeah, my wife texts me a grocery shopping list, right? And I do most of the grocery shopping, and so she texted me a list, and then she wrote, not too long ago, she put a little postscript, a little PS. "By the way, Michael, make sure to bring home some strippers." And I looked at that and I said, so I'm doing some interpretive hermeneutics here, right? I'm doing some interpretive hermeneutics. I said, I think she means stripples. And so I went to the aisle, and so I went and bought myself some stripples, and I checked out in the grocery line, and I showed the cashier, and I showed the text message. I said, "Do you think I got the right thing?" She said, "You're a good husband." Yeah. So, we all practice hermeneutics, do we not? What is the intent of the message that is there, not just the mere literal words? But some people in the fundamentalist movement began to teach that every word is literally inspired. There can be, so this kind of rigid way of interpreting inspired writings that begins to become very important in this fundamentalist, rigid, narrow framework of inspired writings. You see where I'm going with this, right? And some people are not only doing that with the Bible, they're doing it with Ellen White and her writings as well. And two people that did that par excellence were two men, Clyde Holmes and J.S. Washburn. And they believe that every word that it's almost like a divine conduit, like a typewriter. Ellen White was just kind of typing out the words, literally, that there could be no need for revisions or changes in her writings, because this is God literally, rigidly inspiring these writings. And so they began to be concerned that there were some church leaders that were teaching a more what they considered liberal way, although that's really not fair to say, because compared to the modernists, they were not anywhere in that camp at all. But the fact that they had a more flexible understanding of inspiration, they saw that as a threat to their rigid and narrow way of interpreting inspired writings. And they thought those church leaders that were not as rigid and faithful as they were, kind of like my potluck police there, that they needed to be destroyed. And one of those people that needed to be destroyed was General Conference President A.G. Daniels. Now, they had some very interesting chutzpah here. They actually got some of the private letters from Ellen White of counsel and rebuke to Daniels as church president when she was still alive, and had been only just a few years before. They actually managed to get access to those letters, copied those letters, and then when A.G. Daniels came back from a trip, arranged to have a meeting and said, Brother Daniels, Ellen White wanted you to resign. I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, here we have copies of these letters." And the letters said things like, "You would do well, Elder Daniels, if you don't lead through your own personal example and hold evangelistic meetings. You'd better resign as General Conference President if you're not willing to lead through your own example." Well, those admonitions, actually, they didn't know it, but Daniels had heeded those counsels and had done those things that Ellen White had asked. And any living prophet makes very strong rebukes at times, but they were lacking the historical context. They were lacking the other side of what had happened. And more importantly, they had breached confidentiality in copying testimonies without permission and gaining access. And now they were essentially trying to threaten and blackmail the General Conference president. You better resign. They felt it was their mission to take out those church leaders. Can you imagine the chutzpah to go up? And Elder Daniel said, well, who gave you permission to copy those letters? And I said, well, nobody. Well, how'd you get them? Well, they didn't want to say. He said, well, you need to return those. Those don't belong to you. Those are stolen. And they said, no, you better resign. He said, if you don't return them, you're fired. And, well, they were fired, and they spent the rest of their lives attacking church leaders, including Daniel's and others. In fact, they became so bitter, that after they both passed away, one of the saddest things I've ever read in the archives was letters from their children writing letters of apology to the General Conference leaders their parents spent all those years attacking. And of course, they had long left Adventism behind. They said anything that would make their parents so bitter as that, they wanted nothing to do with it. Sad to say. But here's these pamphlet wars that were going on, pamphlets attacking church leaders, things like the omega of apostasy. It's dangerous. If you're not careful, you could be swept up by some kind of spurious heresy. And so these are the kinds of things. And the testimonies began to be used as a club. Here's actually an editorial by the editor of the Review, F.M. Wilcox. He's concerned that in the midst of trying to protect the faith and to be fundamentalists, that some people had developed a bad habit of using the testimonies as a club, as a weapon. And this is the problem that is happening with fundamentalism in the 1920s and specifically at the 1919 Bible Conference. Well, I'm going to only take a couple more minutes, and I'll spend some more time tomorrow afternoon talking about the 1919 Bible Conference and its aftermath. But we had about 65 individuals who actually gathered together for about 6 weeks to talk about how do we interpret inspired writings. Remember those prophecy conferences those other Christian churches were having? Well, they said, we have a solution for our church. If we could lock up all of our theologians and historians for the summer, lock them up in a room, and at the end of the summer, they will all agree, right? And guess what? They did not. And Clifton Taylor, now I have Pastors Sean and Pastor Bill Brace to thank for this because it's a relative of theirs that has a diary, and I still have my photocopy of that diary at least. The only known diary of a participant at the 1919 Bible Conference, and the only Canadian to be at the 1919 Bible Conference. How do you like that? At this gathering of Adventist church leaders that would be so pivotal in discussing inspiration, hermeneutics, Ellen White. And he says that Jack Dempsey was fighting for the World Heavyweight Championship that summer in Washington, D.C. in 1919, and they had on megaphones all across the city, so wherever they went, they could hear blow by blow as the heavyweight championship was taking place. And he said Jack Dempsey had nothing on the Adventists at the 1919 Bible Conference as blow by blow was being, he said the big guns were waging war with one another. Remember that whole thing about militancy and fighting and defending the faith? That's exactly what's going on within Adventism. And Adventism, for the first time, would have a very serious discussion. How do we interpret Ellen White's writings? How do we interpret inspired writings? How do we interpret the Bible? And for the very first time, we begin to see terms like the liberals versus the conservatives, or the progressives against the traditionalists. Does that sound familiar? Certainly that's existed in human history, but especially now it becomes in crystal focus. In fact, my doctoral advisor, George Knight, he one time said, I really love this, I think it's just so poignant, that there should be an 11th commandment: thou shalt not do theology against thy neighbor. Because remember how sometimes when we push each other, you have your list of quotes, I have my list of quotes, we have Sabbath school, we have prayer meeting, whatever it is. But the problem is that when we come to in a combative attitude to fight and destroy those we are against, that we end up pushing each other farther apart. And this is the challenge. We don't need that in the church because we're actually We're defining our faith not from Scripture anymore, but rather by what we're against, what we're opposed to, or what we're afraid of, or what we're threatened by. And the danger is that then we push ourselves to a dangerous extreme. And this is the problem that takes place in 1919. I'm going to leave you lingering in this picture because we'll pick up tomorrow afternoon talking a little bit more about what happens at the 1919 Bible Conference, and especially the aftermath of the 1919 Bible Conference, because I'm going to just leave this with you to kind of tantalize you just a little bit, that the 1919 Bible Conference will have a profound impact on Adventism in the 20th century, and that a lot of our debates then in the Adventist Church all the way up to the present continue as a result of these debates, these hermeneutical divides and debates that began in 1919. But suffice it to say that this was a pivotal turning point in our Adventist past, because how we interpret inspired writings matters. It makes a profound difference. And so doing so in a faithful way that's hermeneutically balanced, is faithful to Scripture, but it's not based in extremes by what we're against, we can begin to see that there is maybe a healthier and more balanced approach to inspired writings, including the writings of Ellen White. And I want to leave you also with the thought that one of the biggest challenges we have with Ellen White isn't Ellen White, but the way people have interpreted Ellen White after her death and the intervening time since then. So thank you for letting me explore with you just a little bit, defining what fundamentalism is as we kind of begin this series, but also talking a little bit more about inspired writings and why and how we go about doing that really makes a profound difference. So looking forward to the rest of the weekend with you, but I think we have a little bit of time for some Q&A or... Yeah.
Thank you for that good foundation for our weekend of dialogue. And we plan dialogue in each session.
Good.
We got started a little late tonight, and we'll go just about 5 minutes longer than was scheduled. And this is a good time for dialogue to explore some of the things that have been introduced. We've got 2 microphones wandering around, and it's a good time to present to the presenter to respond.
If the 1919 Bible Conference minutes hadn't been buried for 50 years, make an estimate on what that would have done to Adventism during that period of time up until the 1970s.
Yeah, that's a good question. I argue that the 1919 Bible Conference wasn't so much that they were buried or hidden, they were forgotten. And because they weren't, it wasn't like they were sealed. When I found them and I began looking through and studying them in depth, I discovered that there were whole bunches of sections of the 1919 Bible Conference that were missing. In fact, we only probably have about 15% of the transcripts because they just got pilfered. And we have at least 3 or 4 books that were published. Now, I think a lot of people just assume that the 1919 Bible Conference, that it's almost as if they were hidden. Now, the poignant discussions about inspiration at the end were what were galvanizing for Adventists in the 1970s when those were discussed, because people in the 70s said, wait a minute, there were all of these discussions about inspiration, very candid discussions, a couple generations earlier, but nobody told us. How is it that they understood and knew the nuances of a flexible view of inspiration and the problems of hermeneutics? And but we had people that tried, and W.W. Prescott was one of them. He published 2 volumes of his talks from the 1919 Bible Conference and published numerous articles calling for a more moderate understanding of inspiration. And he was especially concerned about some church leaders that were beginning to teach things that we would probably call last generation theology or perfectionism. And he began to write against that. And I'll talk more about that tomorrow afternoon. But yeah, so there were attempts. There's always the what-ifs of history. If they had done more, if they had released even more of the transcripts, could it have changed things? I don't know. Those are the things we don't know. Good question.
All right. Other thoughts, things you'd like to explore?
Yes, so why haven't we used the word evangelical in our Adventist circles? Merely because I think it's because it was misunderstood to referring to Protestantism instead of, you know, the description you gave over there was very nice. And I was trying to do my own Googling, and I was like, we should feel like we are evangelicals, but, you know, it's like you belong to other Protestants, but not the Adventist. Is there any reason behind that?
You know, our earliest Adventists were much more, I know the word is maybe some Adventists are allergic to it, but the word is ecumenical. If you look at James and Ellen White, they invited leaders from other denominations to come to our general conference session, and they would attend meetings of other general conferences of other denominations. And so I think the idea that we have to protect ourselves from other churches, certainly we've always understood the fallen Protestant churches as being Babylon, but that didn't mean that we couldn't talk to them or have discussions with them and that kind of thing. And so I find that people like James and Ellen White, our pioneers, were far more open than many people have been since then. So now the problem is the term evangelical, to kind of take off with that, in the 1970s and 80s began in America to take on a very different political meaning with American politics and everything else, and began to represent a whole different set of issues. And so that has kind of complicated things because we have culture wars going on within our country, all of that. And so that makes it a little bit harder, but officially as a church, we've always remained active in dialoguing with leaders of other denominations. And we have that regularly happening at the General Conference, where we've had these dialogues between different denominations. We've had that at the North American Division too, where people have questions and want to know. And so we try to keep a really open view. And so evangelical in the broadest sense of the term, I hope most people would see that even today that we are, at least in that classic historical sense, that we are still very much evangelical. So, but we have to be careful to define our terms or what we mean by things, because obviously that can be a little bit of a loaded term for some people today. Yeah.
For years, the pastoral pool of northern New England came from AUC. And Herbert Douglas was head of the theology department at AUC, taught the classes. The pastor that I studied with when I joined the church was a student of Herbert Douglas. And the majority of pastors in this area would have qualified as strict fundamentalists because of their training.
Sure.
For years, I was an evangelical pastor with fundamentalist congregations, and the frustrations that go along with it.
Yeah, it does.
You're sharing a comment about the reality of your experience.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Before my question, I want to point out that I was a history major that took World Civ from Dr. Shadell in Columbia Hall, and it burned my freshman year.
Oh, did it really?
Yes.
You didn't burn it down, though, did you?
The jury's still out.
Okay.
My question is, how many of those in this picture had educational background outside of Adventism?
Yeah, that would be 3. 3 had education outside of Adventism. One was E.F. Albertsworth, who had the first PhD in history from George Washington University. The other was had a degree, I forget what area it was in, but it was B.G. Wilkinson. And a third person that's there had been a missionary and had a degree from the University of Chicago. So we had 3 people of the 65 that had degrees from elsewhere.
Didn't Prescott? Did he go to Dartmouth?
For his undergrad.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I guess if you're talking outside, I guess that does count, right? Yeah, so maybe 4, but yeah, but graduate degrees 3, and so there was a number of people. They had some very technical discussions about biblical languages, for example, which is quite enlightening to see how well versed they were, as well as in French and German. But people that were trained as academics were also a little bit dangerous. And one of the more unusual stories I found is E.F. Albertsworth, the first Adventist historian, got chased out of the church after the 1919 Bible Conference, and what I believe was the very first Jesuit scandal in Adventist history, because they felt that he was so dangerous that they needed to get rid of him. So a certain church leader put up a couple of students that testified that they had seen mail from the Vatican in his mailbox, and therefore he was a Jesuit sympathizer, and so he got fired, lost his job. They felt so terrible about what happened later that they wrote confessions. That's how we know about it, and so that's the first, documented Jesuit scandal in Adventist history, and he went on to become a very famous historian, teaching the rest of his career at the University of California, Santa Barbara, wrote many numerous articles and awards and everything else. So sometimes people say, well, if you leave Adventism, you'll become nothing, right? Well, in this case, he became a very famous historian, but it's a tragic story because we could have kept him in the church, and it's only through deceit and lying that he was chased out of the church by some people who felt threatened by his training and degrees. So it's a very sad story.
In the picture, I'm wanting you to comment on the aspect of we're a part of culture's story.
Of course.
There's two women, but what was their role?
Yeah, one was, they were both editors. Flora Plummer was one of them, and the other one was, I'm blanking on her name. I wrote an article on her too, but actually there were three women. Only two were in the picture, I believe, but there were three women that were participants of the 19. They were all editors. Yeah. By the way, this picture here, there was a small crop version of the 1919 Bible Conference published in the Review, and for a long time I thought that was the only picture of the 1919 Bible Conference. And when the Review and Herald, at some point, they were throwing away their photograph or part of their photograph collection, it's now closed, and a friend of mine went dumpster diving and found this photograph in the trash. And he said, he recognized it, he said, this is pretty significant. And so he said, I think you should have this as the historian of the 1919 Bible Conference. And so I have that now hanging up in my office, the full original picture of the 1919 Bible Conference. The moral of the story is if you have old historical stuff, don't throw it away. Ask a historian first. And you have a great pastor who's a historian, so don't throw stuff away because you never know. It might have some very important historical significance. So I was thankful that they saved that from it was out in the dumpster. Can you imagine that? I'm so glad it got saved. Yeah. Phil.
I served for a time as the head of the Clergy Association in Chicago, and it was the first time a Seventh-day Adventist had ever been a part of the Clergy Association, let alone the president, as it were.
Yeah.
And so I had the opportunity to just to kind of share what I was all about, and people were astounded that I was normal, what they considered normal anyway, and I'm hoping that our seminary, I know you're no longer at the seminary, but I'm hoping the seminary encourages preachers to get involved with the local clergy group, because otherwise, how are people going to know? Otherwise, they'll get it second or third hand, and might as well get it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
And so it was a privilege to be able to do that, and we had a couple of forums that I would set up and ask provocative questions, and I hope they're still doing that.
I can't speak for all the professors at the seminary today, but I do think that generally speaking, in fact, in ministry, there's a great article about encouraging pastors to be part of clergy associations. I remember as a young pastor, I joined our local clergy association, and they were shocked, and we hosted one of the meetings that next year, and I remember the Nazarene pastor came in. He had tears on his face. He said, I haven't been back in this church since it used to be, I think it was a Nazarene church 50 years before. He had given his heart to Jesus in that sanctuary. He didn't know that he'd ever be welcome, because it's an Adventist church, that he'd ever be welcome inside, to go back inside. So here we are having this some kind of meeting. I forget what it was, some worship or some kind of joint meeting together with the clergy, and he just had tears. He said, "I'm so thankful. Thank you for letting me in. I wanted to think that you were my Christian brothers and sisters," and that was just so personally meaningful to him. And I found many of those clergy to be very encouraging to me as a young pastor as well. I remember my first church board meeting. I kid you not, the topic was, I couldn't make this up if I wanted to, having metal detectors at each entrance of the church so they could catch any of the women with jewelry, especially the teenage girls, so they could send them home. They didn't care about their other metal that they'd carry on their side, or so they're worried about $10 jewelry. And the guy that was doing this, I think he had a $100,000 car and a Rolex watch, but that didn't matter. And the elders of the church had the good sense to turn down his very generous offer. So I thought, I'm the new pastor, so I need to go. And of course, you chair the church board meeting, you don't decide. The church leaders decide, right? So they had the good sense to turn it down, but I knew right away I needed to make a pastoral visit, so I go the next day. And so I showed up at his ranch, very well-to-do person. And first thing he did is pulled out his rifle, said, "Pastor, get off my property." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, don't ever," because I'd heard he likes to say that the pastors never come to visit him. You can wonder why. And so I said, "Well, that's fine, but don't ever tell somebody that the pastor didn't come to visit with you." And I wasn't scared. I work for Jesus, so. But I was feeling a little bad. My first week of pastoral ministry, I already had a church member pull a gun on me, a rifle on me, So I was telling one of the older pastors at the Clergy Association, I said, I can't believe, my first beginning in ministry and stuff like that. I said, "Michael, that's nothing. Don't worry." I had one of my church members, he didn't like a sermon, so after everybody cleared out after church, he was sitting in the back of church and he shot up the cross. And he said, "Did he shoot at you?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, if they're not shooting at you, you're fine." So it could be worse. It could be worse. So I'm so thankful for those older, experienced pastors who encouraged me when I was feeling a little bit discouraged. So there you go. Yeah, the things you didn't want to ever know.
Do you know if anything similar to what was going on in 1919 was happening in other religious traditions, or was it unique to Adventism?
No, it was happening in a lot of different denominations. In fact, I took a doctoral seminar at the University of Notre Dame with Dr. George Marsden. Everyone around the table was from a different religious tradition, and every single person around that table in that doctoral seminar was writing a dissertation on fundamentalism and their particular denomination. And almost all of us that were around that table have published books on it since then. That was maybe 20 years ago. And there's a lot of scholarship on fundamentalism. We're far from unique in that respect. Although some churches divided, they split between a more modernist fundamentalist and Adventism. Everyone said, "No, we're fundamentalists." The question was, how fundamentalist would we be? Would we have a little bit more flexible, moderate view of fundamentalism that allowed for a more moderate view of inspiration, or are we going to go hardcore rigid in how we interpret inspired writings? And that's the crux of where the fight was within Adventism. But certainly there's a lot of different stories. And in fact, your pastor, Sean Brace, his advisor, I think, didn't he edit the Oxford Handbook on Fundamentalism? Yeah, so there's a lot of scholarship. I did a bibliography some time ago. It was several hundred pages long of scholarship on fundamentalism in various different denominations. So it's a great topic to explore. Yeah.
This is a very simple question, but I might have missed it in the discourse. Your working definition of fundamentalism is what?
Yeah, good. I'm glad you asked that. I would go back to what Marsden said, is that's an evangelical who's mad about something. Yeah, so it's a militant way of interpreting inspired writings that would include a very rigid, narrow, inerrant kind of way of interpreting inspired writings. But certainly, it was very conservative Christianity, gone even more conservative, and militantly defending the faith. That's probably the easiest and simplest way to define it. Some people like to define it through theology, as opposed to affirming the deity of Christ and the atonement versus those who saw it as a metaphor. People that affirm miracles in the Bibles versus those who rejected miracles. So there are some theological definitions, but there was some fluidity or variation between denominations, and so probably the easiest and simplest way is to define it as a mindset, a way of rigidly defending the faith is probably the easiest way to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious about how fundamentalism in this era affected the evangelistic efforts of the church at the time, and how that would have in turn maybe affected the fruits of those efforts and the church growth at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. Having spent 6 years in the Philippines, our family served as missionaries. We taught at our seminary in Asia, so traveled extensively through Asia and different parts of the world. I can say that basically our missionaries, some that had a more moderate, flexible view of inspiration, ended up going to certain countries and teaching those things. And there were some that were very rigid and hardcore, and people that were missionaries of that mindset would go and export their variety of a more fundamentalist Adventism to other countries. And so yeah, fundamentalism was kind of, you might say, exported a little bit. And so I'll travel in different countries even to this day. And in one country, you'll see a very different variety of Adventism than you might see in the country exactly next to it. And it has to do with the missionaries who went. Missionaries generally tend to have to be a little bit more flexible, or they don't tend to last very long. And so people that were very rigid and narrow and militant in defending the faith tended to have a harder or more difficult time adapting and being successful in the mission field. But they also, at the same time, tended to believe very much in their cause for which they believed in too. So it's a complicated kind of thing. There's a lot of variation and nuance when you look at that, but you certainly see that today, that in different parts of the world, there's different kinds of or varieties of Adventism, you might say, and that has to go back. You can always go back and trace it to the missionaries who went there. What did they teach? And you see that. Easy way to, now this isn't theology, but easy way to look at that is like how people keep the Sabbath in different countries, right? There's a lot of cultural nuance that happens. But if the early missionaries said a certain way of doing it, then you tended to see a certain way, and that's true also in terms of theology.
Michael, maybe to illustrate this point, I don't know if it was you or Dennis Kaiser, I think it was you, the role of translating Ellen White's writings.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, was it Poland where her some of her writings, like, didn't include affirmations of Christmas, and was that?
Yeah,
was that
I wasn't going to mention the country, but
okay, all right.
But yeah, I mean, how we choose to translate Ellen White in different countries, and the things we choose to translate, and the things we choose to leave out. And so I can think of another country where Ellen White's a communist. They took Steps to Christ, the book, beautiful book, and they rewrote the whole book to make Ellen White to become very emphatically a strong communist. And so we look at that and say, wow, that's strange. But in that country, they thought that was really important because they could say, look, our founding prophetic voice of our church was a communist. Didn't you know? And but if you read the language in that country, you'd say, oh, that doesn't sound like Steps to Christ at all. And so sometimes we add things, and sometimes we leave things out, and have lots of examples of both of those things taking place. And we, through translation, can control what people know about Ellen White. Yeah.
I just want to thank you for your time this evening, and you truly are a great storyteller. I think what stands out to me the most, hopefully this doesn't disappoint you, but when you talk about kind of like the war is back there, but the Adventist Church is still here, so when we have our challenges now, we can be encouraged that the ship probably isn't going to sink because maybe even more things were going on back then than they are today. So I'm looking very forward to coming back and listening to what you have to say, not only in the morning, but you are speaking for the sermon, right?
I think I am, whatever Pastor Brace tells me to do.
Okay, yeah, okay.
We're going to take an offering too, so.
Yeah, okay. And then in the afternoon. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
This is
maybe this is a good, we are right at our closing moment. So, yeah, let's keep in memory our questions, and thank you for that good closing segue.
Good. Should we pray?
Let's pray.
Okay.
God, we're grateful to be together, to have conversation, opportunity in the weekend to explore your leading. Bless us with a night's rest. Bless us, please, with questions and inquiry that will help us sort through the questions and challenges of life today and tomorrow. In Jesus' name.
Amen.